I look for new opportunities. So I've been doing a lot of immersion and 3D, started doing some virtual reality work. And then I started doing these enormous projects where there would be these installations where I could write interesting music. So in Shanghai Tower, for instance, they gave me the top of the Shanghai Tower, which has a 244 loudspeaker 3D environment as an art space. They have a beautiful sculpture there. It's exquisite. And they asked me to write a piece of music for this space. I wrote a piece that involves 4 interlocking orchestras. 3D in an orchestra is very much localized to the instruments you hear next to you. So I had to create a way of making a much more interesting 3D sound. So the way that I could do it was to write a score with 4 separate parts so that I looked like a north, south, east, west space. You hear these music just appearing all over in 3D. And we sort of moved on to things like Pink Floyd, where Pink Floyd asked us to produce these 3D mixes from the original master tapes. And so we set up this 3-dimensional array at Abbey Road Studio 2, which we set up with 9 speakers on the ground floor, then 7 in the first level, and then 2 in the voice of God. Pink Floyd themselves were coming in and listening. It had to be perfect. It couldn't be anything else. We're not trying to make something new. We were trying to make like the most magical rendition of these mixes that we could come up with. They expect, I think, something like 4 or 5 million people will see it over the next 10 years. Part of that exhibition, which was about the history of the band, was in the final section of it was this 3D sound room. And we built this room based on the specification that we generated at Abbey Road. And I'm insanely proud of those mixes. I think they sound great. What you hear in the room is using the Ambio output system. This isn't like a VR thing. This is for live sound in a actual space with loudspeakers. And so we were effectively generating a mix from the masters into this to create an Ambio mix. That's why it sounds so good. It's effectively a Neumann internal system. And I mean, I at the point that the band are that happy, I'm that happy. We've been approached by many other people who've said they want to look at their material to be processed the way, because it's this ability to actually sit inside the music. We found a way of creating it so that you could always feel that you were in the mix, but you could focus on the bass or you could focus on the drums. Nick Mason was really happy with the whole way that it sounded. And there's this point where you have Roger Waters' voice going, hello, hello, hello. And it's above you in the voice of God, 6 meters above. It's cool. Now I tend to work in a purely virtual world. So Pro Tools is the other thing that is essential to my life. Because I'm moving so much material back and forth between editors and engineers, keeping everything in one environment really helps. It makes our lives much more useful. The audio side of Pro Tools is so superior to any of the other options. The composing side is probably not as strong, but I find that it's just, for me, it's the way that I want to work. So I have a mic that I've recently got, which I use for vocals and for a lot of acoustic recording, which is called the SE-Rupert Neve Designs RNT. It's got a balance between, say, a U47 with a KM84 high end. So there are some people making some really interesting microphones out there. That newer U67 that Neumann came out with, which is like all the old 67s without all the problems, but thank God they didn't fix the problems. I have 2 microphones that David Royer made before Royer microphones appeared. And he made 20 of these, 26. And I bought a pair, and Rupert Hine and a few other people, Duncan Sheik and Loon, we all listened to these microphones. They're incredible. I was talking to him about why they sounded so good. And his job before he made microphones was repairing microphones. And he said the problem with the manufacturers at the time, this is in the 90s, was that people were they were making new versions of microphones, trying to fix all the problems in the old microphones. They said the problems are what make the microphone sound the way that they do. We don't want perfect. What we actually want is beautiful. They always say the weird thing which happens with visuals, which you take somebody's face and you mirror it. So you end up with a perfect image, 50-50. It doesn't feel right. We don't want to see something that's perfect. The same thing goes with a microphone or with anything. I'm constantly looking for imperfection. I'm looking for the wrong note. As I get older, I'm finding that I'm wanting less and less perfection and more character. I use a lot of different unusual controllers because I'm trying to find ways of humanizing what I'm doing, and it allows me to I've got a headset that allows me to use my head to guide something into 3D space. I've created a thing with an XYZ axis so that I can move my head and guide something in 3D space. I've created these things where I can, with a ring, there's a little thing that I can put in and I can literally guide again. I can do this and pan something into 3D space. Same thing goes with a piece of music. If I'm using one of these controllers, the fact that I can allow a sound to just have a bit of natural vibrato. When you work with an orchestra, you're listening to 80 people or 100 people or however many living and breathing every note. Part of that is that although in theory, and A is 440, when they're playing the vibrato there, that is moving gently between 441 and 439 or whatever. But each of the players on the violins is choosing their own vibrato slightly differently. Their 440 may be 440.1 or 439.8. All of those variations make the sound smear. It's what makes an orchestra sound bigger than samples, is because everything's a little off. I look for the imperfections. I look for the little off to try and bring stuff to life. I was talking about virtual controllers I use because I have a beautiful Yamaha piano that I use just for playing. And that's great. I mean, upstairs there's a Steinway, and that's when you want to write, you write on the Steinway. But this is for programming and everything else, and it's wonderful. When I'm trying to get a bit of life into something, I use this. Or if you see behind me with the lovely lights, you see the LinnStrument as well. But this is a ROLI Seaboard. This is, I think, the Rise 49. And this has a capacitive touch surface that allows me to, I can start a note here and it tracks like that way, and it tracks pressure, and it tracks this sort of vibrato. And then also I can slide down here as well, so that I can play a chord and then gradually slide the whole chord down. Or I can make a conga go in slightly up in pitch by just literally saying, by sliding up and so on. And I use things like this all the time to try and just mess things up, because what I'm trying to look for is humanity. I mean, the world, for instance, the world has gone modular crazy, and God bless everybody who's done that. I've been there. I was there a long, long time ago, once upon when we actually had to, that's the only thing we could do. And I sort of got over that. This thing of plugging CV in gates into stuff and trying to get a note out and then hoping that you can remember the patch 2 days later. I don't have that luxury, which is why I have to stay in the box, because I'm doing so much music and I have to constantly recall it. There will be changes, there will be fixes. All of that requires instant recall. So I stay inside the box for everything these days. And that's where having things like the ROLI and having things like the LinnStrument run, created by Roger Linn, that's incredible and allows me to play in a different way. I love using these controllers. They give me an opportunity to not be perfect.